Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this class, we're going to talk about intentional torts. And also, this one is a preparation for the midterm exam. Okay, what are we going to talk about in this class? So we're going to talk about 7 intentional torts. They are battery, assault, false imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, or IIED, trespass to land, trespass to chattels, and conversion. And after the discussion of intentional torts, we're going to talk about the possible defenses. They are consent, self-defense, defense of others, defense of property, and necessity. Okay, since they are intentional torts, the commonality of all the 7 torts is intention. In this page, we're going to talk about the intention. What can be constituted as intention and what elements must be met? The first element we need to capture for intentional tort is volitional act. Whether this act is volitional or it is just a reflex. Volitional act means a movement under the actor's control, but not a reflex. For example, Mo pushes Larry. This one is volitional act. But Larry stumbled and hit Curly. Mo's action is volitional, but Larry's stumble is not volitional because it's just a reflex. So Larry isn't liable to Curly. That is how we define volitional act. The second one, we need to evaluate intent. Whether the person have the purpose to expect the upcoming result. Usually, that is very obvious intent. But the tricky part usually happens for the other route. For example, if a person throw a bottle to the crowd, and the person can claim, I don't want to hit anyone, but the point is, his action is still subject to intentional tort because he has a substantial certainty that the result will happen. Once he has the knowledge of the substantial certainty that the result will happen, that also constitutes intent. For example, a baseball player hurls his bat into the stands without meaning to hurt anyone. Even without purpose, he knew with substantial certainty that it would hit someone. That suffices for intent. Next one will be a very testable area. I can guarantee you're going to see that on the issue spotting essay, that is transfer intent. So intent can be transferred between torts or victims. For example, someone intends to trespass, but committing battery. Or someone intends to harm A, but accidentally injured B. Here will be the example. Carl practices high jumps over his neighbor's fence. This is a trespass because he has the volitional act and also he has the intent. But the intent is for trespass. However, accidentally, because of the trespassing, he hit the fiancé. And hitting the fiancé will be subject to battery. So we can see that the intent has been transferred from trespass to battery. The victim also has been transferred from the homeowner and his fiancé. So when we're doing the essay question, and we need to always look for transfer intent. Okay, so now enough preparation for the intent. Now we're going to dive into the 7 different intentional torts. Okay, so now let's dive into the first intentional tort, battery. Battery is very testable. Let's take a look at the definition. Battery is intentional harmful or offensive contact with the plaintiff's person. If we can break the definition down, the first element will be harmful. What does harmful mean? Harmful means injury, whether the person's act contributes injury. The second one, offensive. Probably there's no injury, but the defendant's action is unpermitted. But here will be the tricky part. When we evaluate the essay question, so whether the contact is through the victim's perspective or a reasonable person's perspective. Let me give you an example. For example, if someone tapping your shoulder and ask you where the bathroom is, but you are a very sensitive person, you're saying, oh, you are touching me without my permission, so that's battery. That probably doesn't count as battery, because a reasonable person will not presume that is an unpermitted touch, because this is social norm. So if people want to catch your attention, and probably will slightly tap your shoulder, that is socially allowed. So you cannot sue the person for battery. And the second element is the plaintiff's person. The plaintiff's person includes the plaintiff body and also anything the plaintiff is holding. For example, the plaintiff is holding a plate, and then the defendant is swaying the plate away. So that will be considered battery. So the exam tip is, you are looking for physical touch, whether this one is direct or via an object. But don't forget, always test for battery. Next one, we're going to talk about assault. Assault is very similar with battery. Let's see the definition. Intentional act creating reasonable apprehension of immediate harmful or offensive contact. The only difference you might say between battery and assault is whether there's a physical contact. Assault doesn't require physical contact. As long as the plaintiff have the apprehension of the imminent threat, that constitutes assault. Some people might ask, does the plaintiff need to be feared, intimidated? The answer is no. As long as the person, the plaintiff, is aware about the imminent threat, that checks the element. That meets that element. For example, if a very strong person, like a fighter, boxing fighter, and with a very skinny woman, and then the skinny woman waved the fist into the strong man's face and threatening the man, I'm going to beat you up. The strong man doesn't need to be afraid or feared. As long as he is aware, he knows the woman is going to hit him. That constitutes assault, apprehension. And the second requirement is immediacy. That means the threat is ongoing, immediate, and right away. It cannot be a postponed threat. For example, if someone tells the other, I'm going to kill you tomorrow, so that is not immediate threat. The third, that is the pitfall the students always miss. Whether wording is sufficient for assault. The general answer is no. If only wording is not suffice for assault. Assault must have or combine with some physical interaction. But the physical interaction does not need to be physical contact, but it does require the demonstration of some physical interaction. Example, if A is shaking a fist while threatening B, and that constitutes assault. Next one, false imprisonment. The definition of false imprisonment is intentional act of restraint, confining a plaintiff to a bounded area. So if we break down the definition, here will be some elements. So always look at the elements in the story, in the essay. You're going to ask yourself whether this story contains these elements. The first one, restraint. Whether the story contains restraint. What is a restraint? Restraint can be by force, threat of force, or sometimes inaction. For example, refusing to provide means of escape. And the trick here is the plaintiff generally must be aware of confinement. That means if the plaintiff is not even aware, that doesn't constitute as restraint. For example, someone studying in the library in the evening, but because of too late, the librarian closed the library, and but the person in the library fell asleep that night, the whole night, sleep very tight. And the next morning, the librarian opened the library door. But during the last night, you can say that the person was restrained in the library. Does that constitute of false imprisonment? Probably not, because the person wasn't even aware he was confined. The second element is the bounded area. Bounded area means restricted place. But only inconvenience is not sufficient. For example, you're just saying that, open the door is very difficult, or the door is so far, I have to walk 5 minutes, go to the door. So that does not sufficient. It's not sufficient. And no bounded area if a reasonable means of escape exists and the plaintiff knows of it. So if the person knows there's a way to escape, and that's not imprisonment. However, if there's a very easy escape, but the plaintiff doesn't know, that constitutes bounded area. For example, there's a hidden door in this room behind a very big painting. But no one knows. The plaintiff doesn't know. Even though it is very easy, you just need to take away the painting and open the door, you can get out. Still, that's imprisonment. That's bounded area. And then the third one would be time is irrelevant. So it doesn't mean the imprisonment need to be at least a certain amount of time. And any time, even a short period, will be sufficient for false imprisonment. It only matters when you are asking for damages. Example. In Whittaker, a woman was brought by ship to the U.S. but denied a boat to reach the shore. That inaction constituted false imprisonment. So even though the inaction is possible to constitute false imprisonment. Next one is the intentional infliction of emotional distress. Abbreviation IIED. Definition. IIED is an outrageous conduct causing severe emotional distress. What is the catchy word? Outrageous. How do we define and satisfy outrageous? Outrageous conduct must be beyond all bounds of decency, mere insults are not enough. We require the continuous conduct. Vulnerable plaintiffs, such as if I'm saying some bad words to a child, an elderly person, or a pregnant woman, because they are very vulnerable. If I say some bad things to them, it might be outrageous comparing to a regular, physical, perfect person. Or in a circumstance with some special defendants, like the common carriers and innkeepers. For example, school bus. The school bus driver insults a child, and that constitutes outrageous conduct. The second element is damages required. The plaintiff needs to demonstrate emotional distress, not just trivial upset. So those are the two elements. So the keynotes for this, very important. So for IIED, we don't require very restrictive intent. Remember the intent we talked about at the beginning? Either the person the person has an intent to expect the result, or the person has substantial certainty the result is going to come. Here, under IIED, regardlessness, recklessness will also contribute to the intent, also constitute intent for recklessness. And also, very interesting side, transfer intent generally not allowed. For example, A has done some outrageous conduct and insult to B. Let's just say B is a child and A is an adult. But the child's mom has seen everything. Oh, you might come to the conclusion, oh yes, there's a transfer intent. So the mom also can sue the defendant IIED because there's transfer intent, right? Okay, but the answer is no. IIED doesn't work here. Okay, keep in mind. Next one is trespass to land. This one is a very common violation in our daily life because accidentally probably we're going to trespass person's land. The definition of trespass to land is the physical invasion of plaintiff's land. Two elements. The first one, active invasion. The intent does not have to be the purpose, or you know that's a boundary. It doesn't matter. As long as you have the volitional act and step your feet into others' property. Probably you don't even know that's the person's property, and you are doing trespass. And the second requirement is the physical object. Only the physical object can be considered trespass. Physical objects means like your roof, a tree, or your body. But intangible invasions like light, odor usually do not count as trespass. The next element is the land includes subsurface, surface, airspace, and any usable bounds. So that means the trespass does not have to be on the earth. It could be in the sky, or it could be in the like a downstairs, underneath, underground. So all of these count as land. Next one, trespass to chattels and conversion. So both involves intentional interference with personal property. So the previous one is the land, real property, and this one is for the personal property. Let's see the trespass to chattel. if someone has done some minor interference or damages to the other's personal property, that constitutes of trespass to chattel. Conversion requires something further. The first one, major damage. The second one, serious interference with possessory rights. And then the last one, if that is a conversion, the plaintiff can seek for the market value. Not only the loss of the value, but the entire value of that item. For example, if A scratched a briefcase, that's a trespass of chattel. But if A took it for a month and refused to return, that's a substantial serious interference with possessory right. So it constitutes conversion. Okay, so now we have covered the 7 intentional torts. So they are battery, assault, false imprisonment, trespass to land, trespass to chattel, conversion, and IIED. So now we're going to flip to the other side to talk about the defenses, affirmative defenses. Okay, the first defense is consent. So the person is not liable for any intentional torts if the person has the consent, because that he doesn't have the intent, he has the permission. So there are several elements, but we do have several elements to satisfy consent. The first one, must have capacity. The plaintiff and defendant must both are normal people, not children, not mentally impaired, not coerced, not deceived. The second one, the consent can be expressed or implied. Express, you just simply say, go ahead. For example, the owner tells the person, go ahead, you can come to my house to cut the grass. Or implied, like in a soccer game. So we have the implied consent that we can have some physical touch. But we do need to understand the scope of the permission. You cannot exceed the scope. Otherwise, that will be liable. For example, player consents to tackles in football, but not to being punched after the whistle. The second affirmative defense is the self-defense. So this is the most popular defense we're going to analyze in the issue spotting essay. Several elements. The first one, the reasonableness belief. The reasonable belief. The person must be reasonable to believe that the harm is coming. It contains both the subjective and objective. Subjective is the person really believe, is truly believe the person did not lie. And objective is, it cannot be a very sensitive person. It has to be any ordinary person in that circumstance will have the same feeling. That's the objectiveness test. The second requirement is a reasonable force allowed. That will be proportionality. Whether you are using the proportional counter force to stop the harm. The third element is the deadly force. Deadly force only if threatened with deadly force. That's similar with the proportional. You cannot say someone is swaying the fist into your face, punch you, and then you're using a gun to shoot him. And retreat requirement is, if you have the opportunity to leave, and you should seek that route first before using the weapon or the counter strike. The example is, if the mugger pulls knife, the victim can use deadly force. The counter example would be, if there's just an annoying shove, the victim may not pull out the gun. Next one will be defense of others. Defense of others are very similar with the self-defense. The only difference is the defendant probably will be another person. The defendant has the same rights as the person defended, and reasonable mistake allowed. We allowed reasonable mistake. For example, D sees A being attacked, reasonably thinks B is aggressor, and D punches B. Defense valid if belief reasonable, even if it is a mistake. Affirmative defenses 4. Defense of property. What if that's not the human's body? That's someone's property. Here will be the elements. The first one. The defense must be reasonable, not deadly force. And deadly force never allowed for property alone. And we do have a hot pursuit doctrine and shopkeeper's privilege. Let's have some examples to nail them down. The first one, shopkeeper's privilege. The shopkeeper may detain suspected shoplifters in reasonable manner or time. And hot pursuit doctrine. Alice sees Bob snatch her purse and run down the street. Alice immediately chases him and tackles him to retrieve it. Both of them are okay, because those will be considered as defense of property. And counterexample is if setting a spring guns in an empty barn. That's a typical case, Catco versus Briney. So that is a no-no, not allowed. Defenses, affirmative defense 5, necessity. Necessity happens only for property torts, like trespass, convention, trespass to chattel. The first one will be the public necessity. If you think that we need to provide the public's best interest, probably you can do in a trespass to chattel, trespass to land, or whatever. And this one will be the complete defense, because you are protecting the community. You are not liable for anything, any damages. The other will be the private necessity. This one will be qualified defense. You will not be liable for the malpractice you are doing, but you might be liable for the damages. Example, city dynamite road of houses to stop spreading fire. So because this is for the public safety, there's no liability. However, a pilot lands on farmer's field to avoid crash. This is the privilege to trespass, but must pay for destroyed crops. Okay, so we have talked about the intentional tort and the affirmative defenses. Now we're going to have a summary. First one, when we're doing the analysis, always think about 2 steps. The first one, has the plaintiff established the prima facie case for an intentional tort? You check the element, the intent, if that's a battery, whether there's a harm, whether there's a unpermission. You check the element. The second one, can the defendant raise an affirmative defense? Always think about the other side. That's what the exam maker wants you to know. If that is a battery, whether you can use one of the defenses to defend the defendant. On exam, especially for issue spotting essay, look for keywords to track the pattern. For example, for battery, you're going to see are there any unpermitted touch. For assault, whether there's an imminent threat. For false imprisonment, whether there's a confinement, known confinement. And for IAD, whether there's an outrageous expression or whether there's an emotional harm. Trespass, we're looking for cross property boundaries. And chattel's conversion, whether we're missing some property. Then always test for defenses, like I just mentioned. In summary, intentional torts are deceptively simple, not very difficult, but the tricky parts lie in nuances, because you always think back and forth. The first one, substantial certainty, that's regarding the intention. And transfer intent, also regarding the intention. And don't forget the reasonableness standard and the limits of defenses. Okay, so we spent almost 30 minutes to go through the exam preparation for intentional tort. And I hope it will help you also prepare for the exam. If you liked my video, my episode, please subscribe it. And I will see you in the next preparation class. Thank you.